So, hello, welcome, Caroline Sinders. Thanks so much for coming to our class and spending some time with us. Would you introduce yourself for our students?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Caroline Sinders. I'm an artist and technologist. I'm just going to give like a slight forewarning. I'm also a professor. I'm also a teacher. And so part of this presentation is also, it's on my work, but that's at the very end. Some of this is also about how I teach and think about data, like with my students. And so I'm really excited to be sharing that with you, and I hope you enjoy it. So as I said earlier, I'm an artist and researcher. I work at the intersections of civil society and the private sector, and I look at the impacts of technology in society and its effects on marginalized groups. I've held residencies with BuzzFeed and Eyebeam, Pioneer Works, the Mozilla Foundation, the Harvard Kennedy School, Ars Electronica, and I used to be a part of a working group at the United Nations on data privacy and children. My background is in journalism, research, design, and art. So I see everything through the lens of legibility, data, and research storytelling. These are skills I honed as a photojournalist. So with these skills, I make art and I do human rights research. I look at how technology impacts society and the complications and complexities of data, but again, focusing through the lens of how design and technology affect people and their everyday lives. So two things. I'm a human rights researcher as much as I am an artist, and I take my art as seriously as I take my writing. I take my policy work as seriously as I take my artwork. I love what I do because they feed each other. Dichotomies are hard for people to understand until you can help make them explained. Complexities and complications are difficult to sense or articulate until they are known or made legible or visualized. So since the beginning of the pandemic, I've been trying to figure out how do I blend these two spaces more as opposed to keep them apart. So this is my current work. It's how I approach problem solving across everything I do. I want to make research, and that includes data because I find it practical, create something that wasn't there before, test a hypothesis to see if it works or if it doesn't. But activism builds off that practical research because activism is helpful, it helps push society forward. Often in a research context, if you're making a recommendation, you have to sort of test that recommendation. I believe in knowledge and trusting the people you're working with, that they would know what works for them. This is where you can work with stakeholders and experts to then threat model or test the recommendations you're making. That's sort of looking at and assessing the impacts. You don't need to actually set up a research environment to test them. Rather, you can do this kind of expert sort of data modeling. Activism is helpful in pushing society forward. It can take research and apply recommendations and demand for those recommendations to be implemented in society. But finally, I take that activism and research and I distill it into something else, art, a poetry that's necessary to help the world function, or so I believe. A further focus of my research and art making focuses on systems design, security, and online harassment. One thing I like about art is that it is, in a way, it can be like a poetic imaginary that responds to current urgency. So it can allow us to create or visualize a future we'd like to see in a way that perhaps traditional research does not allow us to do. So this is why my particular practice, I start with a foundation of research, activism, and then that distills into an artistic process. I'm sure this is something y'all have heard before. Switching into my lecture. Technology and data are not panaceas or cure-alls. They're mirrors of society and inequity in society. So in a way, if we think of data, it becomes a mirror of that. What is decided to be captured? Who decided to capture it? Who decided to store it? Who decided to make it open to the public to use? These are a series of not just research questions, but also political questions. What is important enough to be captured? Eric told me you've already covered Mimi Anoha's missing data sets. That's a lot of what Mimi's exploring in that project, right? Maybe let's go back slightly. What is data? Anderson is a data visualizer who has a great book called Raw Data is an Oxymoron. It wasn't assigned to you, that is my understanding. And I'm going to summarize a chapter. So if you don't want to read it, you don't have to, but I do recommend that you check it out. This is how Gettleman describes data. Units of information in aggregate form as the bedrock of modern policy decisions by authorities, governments and non-governments alike. I think that's a really accurate description, even if we're talking about something like a data set full of cakes, right? someone decided to photograph those cakes. They chose a method, which is an image, and they are using that, let's say, in a way to sort of come up with something. Even if it feels, we can sort of argue, fluffy or fun, it's still a form of a larger system. And that system is data sets in which we build, or we really structure foundations of knowledge on top of data in which we structure systems. And I don't think that a fun data set can necessarily be divorced from a serious one. They both come from the same place, even if they aim to achieve different things, one being humor and one being policy. Data is collected by people and those with agendas, and all people have blind spots. Sometimes data is collected quickly, sometimes without thoughts, just like scraping Twitter. Data can be collected without consent, like CCTV cameras filming our movements. Even if we are being empathetic, data is collected sometimes by those that have time constraints. A project is due, information is needed, the survey has to close. Data is constrained by humanity and living, by timelines and money and deadlines. And I say that so we understand the reality of data collection, because data is the backbone of so many things. This is why I love Gettleman's quote. A neutral and thus incomplete definition of data is units of information. Gettleman's quote, data is units of information in aggregate form that is the bedrock of modern policy decisions by authorities, government and non-government alike. And so data collected under even the best circumstances data even under the best circumstances can be collected and still imperfect. And so I want us to think about that, with data being this sort of backbone of so many decisions made by policymakers used in machine learning, and the backbone of technology decision-making. So this is where we're really coming into play with technology and data are always inherently political, and they are never neutral. It's important to also remember, how does data become presented to the consumer? There are levels or layers of people and jobs in between a consumer interacting with a graphic, which is a data visualization, often used to represent data. If you're reading a newspaper and you're seeing something summarized with a graphic, you're not being shown the data set. And that makes sense. The graphic is the thing for you to understand the context of the data or the major findings. But we have to understand differences between the consumer, the data visualizer, who's making that data consumable and legible to everyday audiences. Perhaps they worked with a statistician or a data expert, right? So we have these layers. What's important to understand is that layer of transition. How do these different kinds of people understand and misunderstand data? This is where I think it's important to think about how we present data as units. What are the assumptions we're making? How are we making legible our findings? Even when we talk about the size and scale of data, it can be hard to grasp. For example, Gettleman writes in this chapter, quote, my iPad can handle 64 gigs of data, end quote. But do consumers really know what that means? So this really disconnect of how people understand and misunderstand data, even something as simple as how much storage a device has. What does 64 gigs really mean versus, let's say, 124? What are the amount of things that can hold, right? Do we have an innate idea in our mind of how many images 64 gigs is? It would depend upon what camera you use to take them, if they are flattened or not, and things like that. So things that even feel straightforward in terms of like representation of 64 gigs are actually not very straightforward at all. This is a very long that I'll effectively sort of summarize. We'll sort of pause here. Please pause your video and read it. So there's no way for us to like spend a moment off grid. Everything we do at some point during the day is caught and captured and stored somewhere. So it's very, very difficult to actually like completely disappear for a few hours or even a few days from these larger scale data collection systems. And I think this is really important of thinking about subjective versus objective data. Subjective data affects us, even the visualizers, artists, technologists, and the collectors, because so much is being collected, we often don't know what's being collected. And so Gettleman sort of talks about, how did we get here? World War II brought the era of big science, and then the millennium brought us the era of big data. And these can be definitely tied to each other. This idea that data illuminates and solves problems, which is true. We need data. We definitely need data at times to understand the world around us, to understand context. But it's important to think about like, what is subjective versus objective? And can we ever have pure objectivity? Which I don't necessarily think that's possible, which I'll explain in a second. I'm going to sort of summarize this in case y'all don't know it. I know this is probably a case Eric does know. It came out over a decade ago, but it made a really, really big splash when it came out. Target in 2012 had figured out a way to data mine its way into your womb, this article writes, to figure out whether you're going to have a baby long before you start buying diapers. Charles Digg outlines in the New York Times how Target tries to hook parents to be at the crucial moment before they turn rampant and loyal customers of buyers of all things plastic. He then speaks to this Target statistician about how to look for clues for impending bundles of joy. So Target assigns every customer a guest ID number tied to a credit card, a name, or an email address that becomes a bucket that stores the history of everything that person bought and any demographic information Target has collected from them or bought from other sources. Meaning, even if I'm not giving Target my name, but I'm using a credit card, they're creating an ID about me. They can go to a data miner and buy more information about my credit card ID. This is extremely legal in the United States. It is less legal in Europe, by the way. Pohl, the statistician, looked at historical data for all women who had signed up for Target baby registries in the past. He ran a bunch of tests, and then he started seeing useful patterns emerge. For example, lotions. People buy lots of lotions, but this data team noticed that women on the baby register were buying larger quantities of unscented lotions around the time of their second trimester. Another analyst noticed that in the first 20 weeks, pregnant women loaded up on supplements like calcium, magnesium, and zinc. Many shoppers started to purchase soap and cotton balls. So when they noticed that someone started buying a lot of scent-free soap and extra big bags of cotton balls, in addition to hand sanitizers and washcloths, it signaled that someone was pregnant or getting close to their delivery date. So then Target, without asking these people, started sending them coupons for baby items according to their pregnancy scores. The reasons for this article was written is an angry man went inside of a Target in Minneapolis demanding to talk to the manager. He said, "My daughter got this in the mail. She's still in high school. Why are you sending her coupons for baby clothes and cribs? Are you trying to encourage her to get pregnant?" The manager didn't know what she was talking about. The manager apologized. A few days later, the man's daughter and apologized because the daughter was in fact pregnant and had not told her dad. So while this sounds like a kind of perhaps funny or innocuous detail, I think it's really important to sort of think about and highlight, well, what are the contexts of us analyzing this data? I think more importantly, this could have ended really poorly for the teenager in question. Her father could have hurt her in a way, for Target kind of outing her without her consent, right? So one of the things I try to get my students to think about is, what are the ripple effects of our actions, and what are the unforeseen consequences of these kinds of decisions being made, right? In this case, this teenager was really lucky that her father didn't kick her out or didn't abuse her for being pregnant, right? So the story could have had a very, very dark ending, depending upon, even though Target was technically right in their analysis that she was pregnant, it can have these really unforeseen consequences, right? So one of the reasons I want to share this is something I talk about a lot with my students, which is cooked versus raw data. So no data is really ever raw. It's always cooked. The second we decide to capture it, the method and the unit or the place where we put it, the Excel spreadsheet, the way that we define it or create value, it's already a decision that's being made. There's no ever way, with regardless of how you're recording data, to ever make it raw. The second you record data, it's already cooked.
Caroline, I have a question.
Oh yeah.
What about my birthday? Isn't my birthday raw data? What's cooked about a birthday?
That's a great question. So let's say your birthday is January 1st, 2001. Why the year 2001? Is that an agreed upon year? Is that a universal year? We have different years, for example, in Judaism than we do in, I guess, whatever calendar it is we're currently using. Why is the month called January? Why do we count days with 1 instead of having 0? So all of this, even the method of record keeping, right, of just saying this is a birth date, even if it feels like a standard value, the fact that it's recorded is what makes it, right, non-raw data. Why the month of January, right? And again, If we look at older calendars, there were different ways to describe what a day was or a day of a week. And this is the current calendar that we're in. It's the same thing even with seconds, right? Or time. We're using a certain standard. For example, like, why do we always start over with a minute? Why isn't it longer than that? Why isn't it ever going? So instead of saying I was born at 5:55 p.m., shouldn't it be 5,000,006 or something, right? Like, why do we start over? So these are like a decision, these are a series of decisions that we've made, even if they sound silly, but everything is cooked the second we record it, because we're putting it in a particular bucket and place that's a particular set of values already ascribed to it. So there's no such thing as raw data. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just thinking now, I lived in Japan and they date their years by the emperor's birthday. And so my birthday would be a reflection of the emperor's, how many years the emperor has been in power. And so just even the decision to say what birthday year I have really is a very culturally specific, culturally determined piece of information that actually also says to someone in Japan that we're not using your system, right?
Exactly.
Okay. I get it. I think I get it.
I think about this a lot when one of my closest friends is Jewish, and whenever I tell her Happy New Year, or my friends who are Iranian, and recognizing that January 1st is a new year that they celebrate, but that's not their new year that they celebrate. And I think that this sounds, I recognize that like some of the examples, students, that I'm giving you may sound silly or like not problematic, but like, let's apply this in a real context. If you are trying to like just record data about people, how many choices for gender are you allowing for? Right? And so that becomes an inherently a political question as well as a cultural question. And the fact that you're going to record it says something. You can decide to not record it, but then what are the things you're choosing to decide, right? So then you're making a series of decisions. Even if you're like, I don't want to record any demographic data, let's say you're recording something of like what people are saying, that's also a choice. You're still recording it. How many characters are you going to hold, right? Like if it's audio, how long is the audio? How long is the video? Like all of these things, sort of the second you record them, you're putting, like, how did you decide to put them in a list? Maybe it's the order of the way you did the interviews. Well, then that becomes already a linear order, right? So there are all these things that are related to this idea of data collection. Even if we feel like we're not collecting data, we are. And I just think it's really important to remember that like we're making a series of decisions. I will also say I don't think it's wrong to collect data. I just think it's important to recognize that there's never raw data, so we can move away from this idea of neutral data. We should greet the fact that it is biased in a way and try to work to mitigate that. And a way to do that is to just be honest that we're collecting data and that there's already a series of value judgments within that. Gettleman also talks about that like it's effectively impossible to have like neutral data. Like objectivity is situated and it's also historically specific. Earlier photography, for example, was described as being objective. Objective can be neutral. So photography, I was trained as a photographer. Early photography was considered a science because it was pure visual mimicry, and it had to really fight to be seen as art. And what I find really interesting is that early photography is not scientific. Like this is The Drowned Man by Hippolyte Boyard. People thought that this was real, but this is like a photograph that he just sort of layered two negatives over. There's nothing objective about this. It's all subjective and creative. So I think that's also a way to think about data. No data is truly neutral, right? As Eric said, the way you even choose to record a year for your birthday or like sort of distill that also has political choices, right? And I bring up this just to sort of leave y'all with, sometimes we assume that information, data, and knowledge are the same things, and they're actually really different. Information and knowledge can come from data, but they are not inherently a part of data. Information can sort of inform knowledge, for example, but that doesn't mean information alone grants us knowledge. The way I think of knowledge is, for example, context and some expertise around a situation. Data can add to that. Information is almost a way that we can think of intellectualizing data, perhaps, in a way, but these are not necessarily the same. So it's also a way to think about, and then conversely, data is, I think, also much closer to information in a way. Data isn't just numbers. It can be a specific kind of context, but how are you contextualizing that data? Again, if we're gathering data, even about all of our birth dates in this class, what is the pertinent information for us to know? Is it perhaps where the school is located, or how we chose to decide to capture our birth dates, right? So what is like the important other contextualizing information we need? I also want to cover a practitioner whose work I really, really enjoy, named Abigail Echo Hawk. Hold on, it's supposed to be playing. There we go, the GIF. So she is the Chief Research Officer for the Seattle Indian Health Board and Indigenous Native American. And what she's doing is creating programs that are sort of pushing to help, they're pushing to explore decolonization while also serving her community. And so the Urban Indian Health Institute was born out of this place of Native Americans as statistically insignificant. What I mean by that is if you actually look at like a population breakdown, Indigenous Native Americans are like less than 1% of the population of the United States. That's considered statistically insignificant, but that's an entire group of people. So what does it mean oftentimes to be captured in data sets, but then to not be shown? That's something very particular about a very particular group of people. They're often bundled, if you will, into other groups. They become the other in data sets. And that's a problem because there's a particular set of issues that Indigenous Native Americans will have. For example, not being widely represented, perhaps facing certain issues. Are their lived experiences, let's say, similar to Asian American Pacific Islanders? Perhaps not, but why are they bundled together? So part of this I'm presenting here is for us to think about what does it mean to be in the other, and why at times, like who do we group into the other and why, and what are the best ways to represent or respect those groups? I love this statement because she's talking about how data is gathered, not to necessarily serve the group, but to shame, to show its deficits and problems. So what could data look like that's designed to help or support? So I asked this as a reflective question. I don't quite answer myself, but it's worth thinking about. So I think it's something for us to think about if we were to generate our own data sets together, let's say about a group of people, images or not, what does that say about those groups of people? Do they have access to the images? Are they represented in a way that they feel like is respectful or truthful? How did we come to those decisions? I say this as an photojournalist and portrait photographer, but still a photographer. I had a lot of power on the other side of that camera in terms of how people were represented. My goal was to be as truthful as possible, but I was still making those decisions, right? So like even as a photojournalist, there's a lack in a way, like because I'm making those decisions, images are still not necessarily truthful. It's my interpretation of a situation. So I want us to think about that, especially when we're dealing with images. How are they represented? Why were they structured that way? You know, what is appearing in the photograph? What is left out of the photograph? So I bring this also to present, I think, a really outstanding definition of decolonizing data. Decolonizing data means the community itself is the one determining what is the information they want us to gather. So why are we gathering it? Who's interpreting it? And how are we interpreting it in a way that truly serves communities? Abigail Echo Hawk, this is, I believe her quote, decolonizing data is about controlling our own story and making decisions based on what's best for our people. That hasn't been done in data before, and that's what's shifting and changing. And Abigail Echo Hawk considers data storytelling as a part of Indigenous culture because data is a story in a way, and each person who contributes to that data is also a storyteller. And I think that this is really important to think about. The data is never necessarily neutral. It's also not necessarily cold or mechanical. Data can be extremely human. And this is what Abigail Echo Hawk is talking about. In my own human rights work, I often work studying online harassment, and I often work with victims of online harassment. So one thing I like to say is how every data point is a real victim's personal experience. It's a real experience that happened to a human. And so how can we best represent that and talk about that? One of the things that I believe inspired Abigail Echo Hawk's work was when she was discovering unpublished data about sexual assault against the Native community. And so she went and asked the community, what should we do with this? The community said to publish this. And I'm sort of positing to y'all, do we think that this is a form of data feminism? I would say yes. It maybe doesn't check all the boxes of the 7 principles of data feminism, which we'll get into in a second, but I do believe it's a form of data feminism and data empowerment. And this is sort of really the thrust behind Abigail Echo Hawk's work, is thinking about how, again, being statistically insignificant and thus rendered as the other is a way that continues the genocide against American Indians and Alaskan Natives through data, because when they are invisible, they no longer exist. And I think, again, this is extremely important to consider. So when we think of creating an other, why are we doing that? How can we outline or sort of specify why that happened? And are there ways to uplift stories, particular findings within that group? Could there be a section in a data visualization we're making that really breaks down who is within that other as a further deep dive, for example? I just want us to think about the political ways in which we decide what gets rendered or what gets visualized and what does not. Switching gears because it came up before, I want to feminism. So I said it has 6 principles. The white paper has 6 principles. The book has 7, but they're pretty similar. So it's written by Lauren Klein and Catherine D'Ignacio, and their work comes out of a deep analysis and analyzing of mapping social science and technology, of relooking at spaces and critiquing them through a feminist lens. These are the 6 principles from the white paper: rethinking binaries and hierarchies, elevating embodiment and emotion, embracing pluralism, considering context, legitimizing embodiment and affect, and making labor visible. And then these are from the book. And as you can see, they're actually pretty similar. It's examining power, challenging power, rethinking binaries and hierarchies, elevating emotion and embodiment, embracing pluralism, considering context, and making labor visible. So the data feminism principles deeply inspire my own work, which we'll see in a second with my feminist data set project. Feminist data set actually started before the white paper came out. One thing y'all should keep in mind is, like, in the mid-teens, I guess, like 2015 onward, there's been like a lot of push and a lot of contextualizing around how we need feminist interpretations of technology. There's a very rich history of this. And of Catherine D'Ignacio's in particular, as she's someone I regularly talk to, and I know she's a big fan of my work. And feminist data set does utilize the data feminism principles. So maybe let's put that into practice. How would we build an intersectionally feminist data set so we can acknowledge the data feminism principles? We can recognize history. So I say this to you in New Orleans, where I'm from, where I live half the year. New Orleans is a city where most people that are born there stay there, and they often stay in the neighborhoods they're born in. New Orleans is also rapidly undergoing gentrification from the introduction of technology companies like Airbnb, which are destroying our neighborhoods. So if we go 30 years back, one neighborhood may be incredibly different, right? Or we can contextualize this in another way. My partner is from Croatia. So if we go 35 years back, Croatia was called another country. It was called Yugoslavia. If we go 60 years back, Croatia was becoming Yugoslavia at that time. And if we go 120 years back, Croatia was part of the Ottoman Empire. And so I think it's really important to understand even something as basic as the city of Zagreb, where my partner lived for 10 years. Well, how do we think of the historical context that city has undergone? We could look at Berlin, a place I lived 3 years ago. What was Berlin like, let's say, in the 1950s. It was split between two different world powers, and it was a part of two different countries. So a neighborhood you could be living in could be East Berlin, which would be a part of the Eastern Bloc, a part of the Soviet Union, right? Now it's a part of Germany, the country. And I think that that's just incredibly important to think about, right? How do we sort of look back and consider that context? Another thing to consider is identity. Are you the right person to be also gathering this data? How do our data points or data structures change when someone's race or gender or identity sit in our data? Are we the ones to gather it? Will people give us the data we need because we seem trustworthy? What I mean by this is I work a lot in New Orleans, but I am a white woman, as you can tell, even though I'm a queer white woman. And so if I'm working in a particular area, like a predominantly Black neighborhood, I have to have community partners with me, even if I'm a part of that community, because it would make sense to not trust me, right? So it's something important to really think about, is acknowledging that kind of identity and the stewardship of data. And then am I including information that's pertinent to that community? Am I collecting that data in the right way? Is the data being cooked in a way that feels more accurate or representational of that community? Importantly, we can think about what's left out of the data set. How can we highlight that missing data? Sometimes it's acknowledging X doesn't exist. You can also think of refusal. Not everything should be collective, saved, or archived. Refusing to create a data set can be an act of intersectionality and an act of protest. It's important to say why that data set doesn't exist. I, at this point, reflect on Tiara Roxanne's work, a mestiza, indigenous North American person. Tiara talked about even if we're collecting things with the idea of decolonizing, that data can still be removed from the community, and that is a further act of violence against indigenous Americans or indigenous North American people. And that sometimes the best thing we can do is actually refuse to be a part of the data set and refuse to participate, or create something as much as we can just for ourselves and refuse for that to be shared. And I think that that's incredibly important to think about. How can we allow for refusal in a data set? So we could put this into practice if you want to try this at home. I'll pause for a second. Maybe you want to take screenshots.
And I'll put some context on here too, is that students will be assembling a data set of images, and these questions are relevant to this as well.
Exactly. So one thing to think about is, where did those images come from? Where are you located? Where are you gathering the data from? Where do the images come from? Did they come from your community? Who made them? How did you go about finding that data? How did you start searching for it? What's in it? What's missing? How would they live up to the data feminism standards, etc.? So these are some of the principles, and these are written again from the context of data visualization, which is also where data feminism comes from. While it talks about data creation, it's also a data visualization practice. So one of the things to think about is rethinking binaries. How can we communicate the limits of our categories in the final representation? How can we allow the user to refactor the categories we have presented? So are we allowing for user input, or truly in a way that moves beyond binary? And that could be even recognizing how we gather countries. Are we using the name that the groups use that live in that area to reflect where they live? For example, I call Palestine a country and not a territory, because it is, and Palestine is occupied in my minds. But think about if we were gathering something with that group, how would they like Palestine to be talked about? To them, it is also a country, is not just a territory. Pluralism refers to Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto of data feminism, calling for new ways of thinking of how to engage with technology. Pluralism is similar to rethinking the binary, but goes a step further and suggests we embrace the lead to openness and encourage pluralism and indefiniteness. Effectively, the way to think about it is pluralism is saying that there's multiple points of view. It's acknowledging that there are many points of view. So it's saying, don't represent the data set as truly neutral. It's not. This is not the view from nowhere. There can never be a view from nowhere. So how can we sort of talk about and say the context of where and how we were gathering this data, because that context matters. Examining power inspiring to empowerment. This is where we can think about the outcome of the data set and how we visualize it. How can visualization empower the people that we were collecting data about or with? How can we sort of best tell those stories? Data visualization and a data practice is inherently one about storytelling. This is where it's important to think about, how do we want to represent the findings? And does that feel truthful, or at least representative? Since truth is hard, does it feel representative of that community or group or organization? And in a way, can we even co-design if that's possible? Considering context is probably the most straightforward one. It is sort of taking into the context. It's taking into context of like where you are gathering data, and also recognizing that making groups to analyze data is hard. And sometimes we also lose context within that. And this is where, if we go back to talking about Abigail Echo Hawk's work, there will be times where you have to make groups together, right, in order to render or visualize a data set. It's important to maybe talk about why you did that, what was learned, how can you go steps further, right? Maybe that is, again, breaking down a particular group and saying, here's why we put these groups together, and inside of that group, here's all the ways in which they differ, and here are the findings, just for example. And this is encouraging us, legitimizing embodiment and affect is the encouragement to think about how to experience to new forms of seeing and knowing. So can we consider tactile, experimental, or new ways of data visualization to tell a story? Perhaps it's not just a graph, perhaps it's an audio exhibit, perhaps it's a series of videos. There's so much more we can do with data visualization just than the traditional way of making. And lastly, we have make labor visible. For me, I take this really seriously even in my art practice. So for example, I interpret making labor visible of talking about who worked on something. That means like when I work on certain art projects, I list every person that helped me. A lot of artists don't do this. I choose to do this. For example, sometimes I work with a video editor to help me make my videos look extremely professional. She's always listed as someone that worked on something. So I think it's incredibly important to talk about and list out who worked on something. And that's the same thing with a data set. How can hands touched and impacted a project? So now finally, we're at feminist data set. Feminist data set is this critical design and art research project that started in 2017 as a response to the many documented cases of problems in technology and bias in machine learning. By machine learning, I used to work in machine learning as a design researcher. So this was something I have been and was thinking about a lot. Feminist data set has been shown across universities, art galleries, museums, like all across the world. It's inspired by the work of the maker movement, critical design, Arte Utile, the critical engineering manifesto, xenofeminism, and the feminist principles of the internet. And one thing I want to highlight is this is a very scrappy project, and this may sound like a lot of money to y'all, but I want to contextualize that this is not a lot of money for a tech art project to receive. But in total, since 2017, the project has, my rough estimate, and I think that this is an overestimate to be honest, has only received $14,000. That includes like the numerous times it's been installed, asked to give workshops, and the different grants it's received. So that is quite a small amount actually for this multi-year project. And I'm pretty sure Eric would probably concur.
Mm-hmm.
So Feminist Data Set's this multi-year project using intersectional feminism as a framework to investigate machine learning. It's trans-inclusive and focuses on racial justice. It's extremely process-driven, so the outputs of the project or the artifacts are these workshops on data and machine learning, essays, printed matter, and documentation. Currently, there are 2 nodes to the Feminist Data Set, though there will be more as we go through the machine learning pipeline. The first node is data collection. The second node is data cleaning. What you see here is a photograph from the project collecting data. This was as a public wall in the gallery where visitors could add notes of data. That was the slide you previously saw. This is the image of us sorting it. The data in Feminist Data Set is written text and any kind of written text. Within the project, the workshops are key because they're a mechanism to think through what community-driven equitable data collection could look like. In the workshops, we discuss, well, what is intersectional data? What does it mean? I give a brief breakdown of machine learning data and the politics of data collection and how data is used in software and technology. And what we determine in that workshop often becomes specific and contextual to the group of people, which is really interesting. At present, I'm attempting to write about the findings overall, which means we might not have one total feminist data set framework, but rather these notable findings to the workshops grouped together under themes with machine learning, like data collection, data cleaning, and model generation. Data collection, we move slow. This is farm to server table style data. And we've built a series of methodologies, pulling from data feminism, but also asking what is legible data, what is consensual data, and what is transparent data. And I say those because in the workshops, we really have to define those as building blocks. So what does transparency mean? Is it making labor visible? Is that enough alone to really be a form of transparency? These are different things we're determining. I've actually written a framework for another project on what I think transparency is for machine learning that I will be applying to this one as well. We talk about consensual data. So everyone that attends the workshop and submits a piece of written data has their name listed. And the next step we're going to include is like, if you're listed in the data set, like it's your text that's been found and submitted, you are allowed to remove it. The question I'm currently grappling with is, should I reach out to every person that's been listed in the data set? Is that consensual enough? Or should I allow them, if they contact me, to remove it? And this is the current thing that I'm grappling with. I lean towards the former, even though it's much harder. The reason I hesitate is that is a lot of labor and a lot of time because we have quite a lot of stuff already submitted. For the most part, with libraries or archives, authors' books or texts are just sort of submitted and it becomes its own sort of collection. But I do wonder how much voice or choice should authors have? Obviously, if someone asks for things to be removed, they will be. But I present this to you to think about when we talk about things like consent. I'm thinking about that in a very specific kind of way. Or when we talk about ethics or equitability, I try to figure out what are the building blocks, what are all the steps I need to ensure that make that. So again, from these workshops, I've been collecting suggestions, frameworks, and protocols, and hopefully all of these will be shared soon. We also talk about Professor Kimberly Crenshaw's work, the creator of the term intersectionality. We also unpack intersectionality in writing. Again, this is a text-based work project. So let's look at so one thing to keep in mind is the texts don't have to be about feminism. They just have to imbue intersectionality. So the way to sort of understand this best, so let's look at an article about income inequality. The intersectional feminist article would highlight that white women, Black women, Indigenous women, Latino women, and trans people of all different races are paid all different amounts. So an article that simply represents all women as a monolith is not intersectional and cannot be in our data set. This is just a small slice of the submitted data. And keep in mind, this is also an archive. One of the things that we have is we actually have no citation requirements. I used to work at the Wikimedia Foundation on the anti-harassment team, and while I deeply respect the policy of citations within the Wikimedia community, it would be inappropriate and unjust of me to talk about feminist data and feminist interventions and not point out how the citation policy adversely affects women, non-cis people, and marginalized voices. People from marginalized communities are cited less than their white male counterparts. If the point of my project is to confront bias, I have to deeply think about my own structures, my own data structures, my own methodologies, and how I myself perpetuate bias effect. I've thought it's not enough to just look for feminist text. I need to reflect the structure of the protocol of what quote unquote kind of text I'm soliciting. So within this, I've removed all citation requirements. Anything can be submitted as long as it's text-based. That's texts, blogs, transcripts of conversations, poems, poetry, essays, even responses written on the spot. Pedagogically, feminist dataset operates in a similar vein to Thomas Twaite's toaster project, which you see here, which Twaite built a commercial toaster from scratch, from melting iron ore to building circuits and creating a new plastic toaster body mold. This is a critical design project really designed to examine like the systems of extraction and sort of point out how actually impossible it is to make this sort of common thing we see everywhere, a toaster. In a way, feminist dataset is similar. My software and models will be as misshapen as this toaster, metaphorically speaking, because we can't really see my model, so to speak. But the project is exploring what does it mean to thoughtfully make machine learning, to carefully consider every angle of making, iterating, and designing. Every step of this process needs to be thoroughly re-examined through a feminist lens, and like Twaite's toaster, it has to work. Here's where a feminist dataset has been installed at the Victoria and Albert Museum. And truth be told, this probably should have been the first slide about feminist data set. I'm an artist and researcher and ultimately a maker. I want to make things and I want to test things. And the goal here is to really take a lot of outstanding work and methodologies and put them to the test by saying, let's build some commercial software. Let's do it by hand. Why? We could say that that's an open source ethos. Let's interrogate that. If we had more time, we could go into, is open source equitable or feminist? Someone who's worked on a trust and safety team at an open source company, I can tell you it's not. But back to this, it's an art and research project that uses participatory methods to ask, what is feminist machine learning and can we create it? By nature, this project is about process. It's about greeting and documenting the friction and acknowledging it's there, because applying a theory to reality will not be perfect. It will be bumpy. So it's about looking at each step and intervention or testing other interventions we deem feminist, explicitly feminist in nature, co-created and coming not just from technologists, but communities, artists, and human rights activists. With data collection, it's a slow process. It's slow doing this thing that feels so instantaneous and big. It's then asking, what are the rights of the data sets? So we set parameters that are flexible and can change. But the purpose is also to say, what does it need to make a data set feminist, and test those suggestions. And then this is the failure and the process. Again, I mentioned I'm a queer cis white woman. Our data set has a lot of white creators in it. From the beginning, we decided to have no citation requirements. BIPOC folks, trans folks, and femmes are underpublished and undercited. Even still, white women are published more than their counterparts. And the data set, despite our efforts, does reflect that. So we add in other changes. No more white women unless that data, which is text, directly relates to the area and where we're holding the workshop. I consider this a failure within the project, but I'm not upset, or rather, I'm not ashamed to say that it's a failure. The project is about surfacing failures and frictions, and I believe this is one worth talking about. And even with institutional buy-in, because we're only held in community spaces or spaces that a community can demonstrate strong ties to, our focus is on the general public. And within all of that, the project has more white and more cis women than other kinds of creators and writers, because again, even still, those are the people that are published more. Those are the ones that are indexed higher on Google, and those are the things easier to find. Lastly, because I think we're running out of time, and you've already read actually about TRK, and so the next few slides directly pull from that article. I'll just finish this. Other aspects of failure come down to technical reasons. I have a MacBook Pro. Is that a piece of feminist technology? No, not really. TRK uses AWS, and that's definitely not feminist. So again, the entire process is greeting failures and frictions when we can and mitigating them. This is about harm reduction as much as testing hypotheses. And we can test and look at all different kinds of STS research that's feminist, and that informs the project as a whole. So I'll quickly skip to the end. For the most part, this is an unfundable project, but that's okay because it's interdisciplinary. So thank you. And I'm back.
Thanks so much. I did want to ask a question. One of the questions I've asked people so far when I've spoken to them is about what AI art is for them. And I think your answer would be really illuminating, because I think you come at it from a very different angle from the way that we in this class have been talking about AI art. You're definitely making, or at least if you were to ask me, I would say you're making AI art. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what is AI art for you?
Well, I guess very generously, and I believe this very much in my bones, like AI is just a paintbrush, and I have like many paintbrushes and many tools, right? Like in my chest of like artistic methods. And so one of the things I really try to do is in some ways sort of, I don't want to say humanize, but like make more legible or more accessible that AI is a tool. It's not the author for me. And so it's an extension of like my ability or capabilities as an artist. I'm very interested in, one could argue, the material design of technology. So like some artists I really love are Forma Phantasma. They are looking at like hard tactical things. Like they do a lot of material analysis of like wood, for example. That's their Cambio project. I think of myself as like a material analyst of software. And so not just like the physical things that make up software, like what makes up digital software. So that's where I think in TRK, where I talk about user experience design being this utilitarian intelligence that it can uplift or subvert or hide data. and how I use design then as an artistic method, that's kind of what I mean. I'm very interested in exploring that. And so that's why a lot of my artwork may at times sort of look like design work. But if you really engage with things like TRK, I think you'll see that it's not software design. It's like something cheekier or more subversive. It just is aping, I guess, or costuming in a way, norms of software design. And so I think of that very similarly with machine learning, because so much of machine learning in our day-to-day lives is inside of product design. So for me, I do definitely consider myself an AI artist because I'm often thinking about how AI is embedded inside of other things. So I have my video project, I don't know if you've seen it, Anger, Disgust, Anger, Disgust, Happiness, Sadness, Fear, and Surprise. And so that's where I create like 4 or 5 vignettes, and I'm sort of walking around Berlin, and I'm using Amazon's recognition system. And so you can see like a running sort of like dialogue of my interior thoughts and how much that doesn't match up with the recognition system. And I definitely consider that of an AI project, even though I'm using like out of the box software, right? And I'm not writing the software, but it's an interrogation effectively of that and of emotion recognition.
And I guess one of the other things to talk about too is that like the purpose of your art making is probably different from some of the other artists we'll talk about who are maybe I mean, you have work in many galleries, you have work in a lot of different places, but the purpose sometimes is more about and again, this is sort of my take, is about illuminating what's going on, right? Do you think that's true, or do you have how would you frame it as the purpose that sort of drives the work?
Well, I feel like you've described my work really, really wonderfully in like Architectures of Violence, which while that was like a show about misinformation, I think that's a good method to sort of think about my work, which is I feel like at times a photojournalist going around taking pictures of the internet. I believe that's how you described it, which I was like, that totally resonates with me. And I think about that a lot in terms of how I look at technology. I think of myself as like the documentarian of technology. And a way to do that is to experiment with it and document those processes. And so for me, like art is a method and a way to explore those topics. Like my friend Anna Riddler, who I believe y'all have probably like looked at her work, she describes my work as like experimental or expanded documentary. And I think that that's a very good way to look at it. That's why like early in the presentation, I was like, the thing to remember is that I was trained as a photojournalist. And so one of the things I say in another presentation, which I probably should have said in this one, is like, I'm really interested in what if you took the principles of photojournalism and applied them to tech art? Like, what kind would you make? And I feel like that's kind of the constraint I have for my own work, because that's sort of the way I see the world. And so that can be something that manifests into an essay, into a workshop, into art pieces. It's just a different kind of art making. And it's not quite like traditional research. So then it kind of puts it into a weird home or a weird place to house. So it's definitely new media. And I think it's no coincidence that like my work gets supported and understood better in places where there's like photography and like photography related new media curators. So people thinking about, let's say like video or experimental documentary.
So I want to turn to some of the practical things that my students are probably going to be thinking about. They're about to be sort of collecting data for themselves, whether they're going out and taking photographs for their data set or finding images from a data set. But we're still probably when people are watching this, they're in this phase of sort of thinking like, what am I going to do? What am I going to make? What's the story that I'm going to be able to tell? And I wondered if you had maybe not ideas or suggestions, but sort of a way that you think about how you might approach something
Right.
like that.
Totally. So I've definitely used found images before. Anna and I did that in a collaborative project early on the pandemic. I think the way to do it is to give yourself a very specific constraint and really reflect on why, like why this topic, and like what are you trying to get at emotionally or like inherently in the topic. So Anna and I used images from previous like vacations we had taken and some found images, like open Creative Common images of like nature. This was in the pandemic where we couldn't really leave our houses and we just missed
Hmm.
engaging with the outside, and even looking at images online felt already artificial. So the goal for us was to make this meditative experience using GAN. So you can like click on it's called Mechanized Cacophonies. It's online. You can all check it out. The idea is that you would have it open on multiple browsers, and each browser would like there's three different variations and they're kind of different. And so you'd have one play, maybe you'd hold another in your phone, and you can just sort of stroke or tap the phone to adjust the volume. And at a certain point, it'll also change the video. And so the idea was like, if we're already going to be missing the outside and it's already mediated through a level of screens, let's just make it more artificial. But how can we also make this like a reflective, meditative response? And so for us, that was this very clear sort of framing of like, why images of seasides, right? Or like, why images of like the beach? And so that framing became very, very clear. We obviously thought really heavily of like, are we allowed to use these images? And so that's another thing I'm not sure if y'all have talked about as copyright, but just remembering and keeping in mind that not all images are fair or free to use.
Mm.
And thinking about what would it feel like if an image you took that you didn't want online or you didn't want off, let's say, your Instagram or something, was like used without your consent. And so I think that's another thing to just keep in mind is like, are you using images that you should be using? Like, did the creator want you to use them? Um, and you know, on like a much more specific level, like a lot of photographers will extend their copyright, which means you can be slapped with all different kinds of lawsuits if you're using images you're not supposed to be using.
Hmm. And this is speaks to a big controversy right now in AI
Yes.
generated images in particular,
Yeah.
is whose art is in that data set and did they get permission? And we spoke in your talk about the idea of sort of data sets and consent to be in that data set, and who can give it and who can take it away. And at the moment, there's really not a lot of mechanisms. So one of the things that students can kind of think
Not a lot of
about,
mechanisms in the United States.
yes, fair. Um, but one of the things students can think about who are in the United States, but even especially if you ever want to show this work in Europe, you have to
Yeah.
be legally
Yeah.
aware. Uh,
Very rare.
Basically, well, now I forgot where I was going, but
Right.
you've got to think about this idea, I think, of where is the work coming from? How are you making it ethically? How are you making it responsibly? And even down to this question of how do you figure out what can be included, how you would let people know, how you would attribute it, right? You talked about recognizing labor. We've talked before in our class about how these data sets got built. A lot of these data sets got built by thousands of people being paid pennies to label them. A lot of them got paid zero because they did it without even knowing it, because they were uploading images of their dog and labeled it dog, right? So I'm sure I have contributed significantly to the dog data set on my Instagram account. But these are things that we have to think about now. We are in the position of designers. We're not just using tools. We're actually creating a data set. And that changes, I think, the way that we should think about the material we're using and making and working with. Um, which I don't know if that's a question, but more of a comment and reflection on the things that you've suggested and the way that you've outlined these responsibilities quite beautifully, I think. But I'll give you a last word if you want to have one.
No, I mean, one thing I also realized I probably should have pointed out to the students is like, so when I say I'm a human rights researcher, I mean, I'm literally like embedded at the data protection and privacy regulator in the United Kingdom. And I like, this is something I'm like I'm there as a researcher, not as an artist, but I'm the only artist there. And so when DALL-E launched, the first thing I noticed was like, there's no way to remove personal data from here. And it's an interesting thing to think about, what is personal data. But like in a way, we could argue all of your text prompts are a form of personal data, and you have a login and you're not allowed to remove that. Under UK's GDPR and EU's GDPR, you should be allowed to. And I think this is where it's important to think about, again, the politics of a data set, that like you are allowed to have ownership over your personal data online. Even if we're sitting in North America right now, in the United States, like both Eric, you and I are, I'm in the US right now, that I'm not given that right. I am given that right in other countries. And I think that that's really important to think about, that you are actually owed that. You may not be allowed it here, but you are owed it. And so how does that change our relationship to data? This is something I like think about a lot. That I talk about with my students is, so I am trying to shift the sort of focus or thinking about data from it being mechanical to it being a precious object. And how does that change the way we then collect data? So how would you treat a data set if it wasn't just like something you could scrape or gather quickly, but you treated it as like one of the most precious objects you owned or had in your contact, like the last recorded conversation of someone you loved before they died? You'd probably be very protective of that data. You would have probably a lot of, hopefully you'd have multiple copies of it. Hopefully you'd be thinking about, how do you store it securely? How would companies treat our data if they viewed it as that precious? One thing I'll also say is, I believe all data is created by people, even if it's two computers analyzing one another's performance. A human at some point decided that that would be analyzed, or they decided that something should be analyzed, and then like this is the output steps later, but it's still coming from a human, right?
Mhm.
Everything that's captured, a command was issued to capture it. So how does it change our relationship to data when we think of it as all of it coming from people, and it's this very precious object? And then furthermore from that, how does it change? How do we then change the way we relate to machine learning data sets if they had expiration dates? So if we could only use a data set for 5 years or 10 years, then you can't use it, but maybe you can see it as like an archive, right? How does that change the way in which we make? I think about this a lot because the backbone of a lot of text prediction is the Enron email data set. That's a very old and very particular data set from one city in one country. In one company. It's like, Enron was based in Houston. It had hundreds of like people working for it, maybe a couple thousand. Probably a lot of them were white people. It's a financial company. That is not representative of people, but also email is written and structured in a very different way than text messaging.
Mm.
So like, what are the things used within that data set, right? And why do we still keep using it? So these are some of the things I want people to sort of grapple with and think about, like how would our sort of societal like view of data shift if we viewed it as precious, if we view them as almost organic materials with like death dates or like use by dates, right? And we sort of insisted that like they be stored securely, respectfully, and I guess very, very, like very securely.
All right, great parting words. So thank you so much. I'm really grateful. I think it was a great talk, and I will let my students know. Well, right now we're still recording, but if they have questions for you, I can send you some questions.
That would be amazing.
Awesome. Okay, cool. So thanks again, and we'll talk soon.
Yay, yeah, thank you.